Hey Collective, it's Al. I'm coming to you as part 2 to a video series I've been doing this week that I promised in yesterday's release, dealing with the current climate of things going on in our world stage from two very distinct perspectives. Speaking yesterday to specifically looking at some of more of the personality types and things that lay at the root of possibilities as to why people act the way that they do, and then wanted to follow it up quickly with another video as a secondary point, looking at it from a more spiritual, philosophical perspective. So this video really is going to center around looking at the world stage and the things going on globally from this perspective of a more esoteric lens. Something that I find very intriguing as a student within the Great Earth Academy, and something that I wanted to share with those of you who stumble upon the video. And essentially one of the things that I was finding as I was going through my own studies, that many of you may have encountered yourself, is that there are different theologies, different philosophies, different ways of looking at the world, but there is a consistent thread of esotericism that exists within the higher realms, and especially the higher understanding of what's going on in our world and some of the things that are playing out. Beginning with the fact that, esoterically speaking, we have come to understand that we are indeed at the end of the Forerunner era, which was basically setting something up in order to then be externalized into the physical world. And many people had kind of talked about the subject, but not really gone into what the possibilities were that were waiting for us on the other side, which is kind of the intention of this video. But through a series of signs and synchronicities, something became very clear to me in regards to some of the video content that I had been releasing over the past year, that basically centered around this idea of a conclave meeting in 2025. And sure enough, I had released, I think it was 4 weeks ago, a video talking about one thing or another. I had mentioned the conclave, and I said, and not necessarily the one that will be happening in the physical world with the Catholic Church. And then sure enough, a series of events happened, and then I ended up having this dream on Good Friday, I think it's called, or Palm Friday, whatever the Friday is before Easter, the one that's like marks the 7 days before the Friday before Easter. I had this a strange series of events happen in my own life where a man was killed outside of my apartment, and for whatever reason, I, in my centralized apartment location, was able to hear the conversations happening from my neighbors, the police that were outside, and kind of had the wherewithal to kind of sit in space and observe, almost as though being the observed and being the observer, understanding the different dilemmas and dichotomies that existed for the people who were inconvenienced or were just doing their daily job. And some of the things that were really striking to me about it were like the cops were laughing and joking with each other, and I could hear them very clearly. Meanwhile, there's a dead body outside of my apartment, and then all of my neighbors were upset that they couldn't get their, Uber Eats, or they couldn't get out of the house at that time, and the inconvenience that death seemed to present to them. So as I sat in that space waiting for them to allow us to leave the apartment, because I wanted to go for a walk and kind of clear my head, one of the things that happened is I came home and I went to bed, and that night I had a very specific dream where I was in church, and I hadn't been to church in a very long time. And so what ended up happening is that in the dream, I was before the Pope, who was giving us our communion, and I was in this really open space type of environment where it was almost like half of a bowl where all the seats were, and then there was the clergy, the bishops, and all those individuals. And during the thing, a series of things happened within the dream, and I suddenly became aware when I woke up that I needed to pay close attention to what was going on with the church, which caught me up to the Friday, Saturday, Sunday of Easter. And so as Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I did something that I don't normally do. I attended Mass through Italy at the Vatican. And so before I would go to work, I would get up in the morning and I would basically watch whatever sermon it was for that Friday. Then again Saturday and again Sunday, not knowing why, I was guided towards paying attention to it. And sure enough, the Pope then dies that night after I had gone to Mass those 3 days in a row. And it was the resurrection of Christ and Easter Sunday and all that stuff. So I went to work not knowing what was going on, and that night the Pope died. And then the next day I woke up and I would go, oh, well, that explains why I suddenly had this dream that I needed to pay attention to what was going on in Italy, and I had no real inclination as to what the outcome would be, but obviously I followed my instincts and just kind of attended the Mass and was looking at it. So as all that went down, I did this thing that I do sometimes when I'm confronted with a series of events that is confirming stuff that I'm feeling intuitively or from a higher perspective. And I then just take a step back and I kind of stop putting out any content in written form or through video, so as to really kind of gauge what was going on with me and why I was getting prompted to do and to experience certain things at that time. So as I was processing all that information, one of the things that became very clear was that there would, of course, be a conclave. And the conclave would then pick the next pope, which reflected the video I had done a month ago, speaking to the fact that we knew esoterically that in 2025 the elders and masters would meet and they would decide the fate of humanity moving forward and some of the things that needed to be implemented in order to move forward. But as all this is happening, when the conclave, the statement of as above, so below, when that actually happened, it caught my attention. I started to really quiet my mind and kind of be on the receiving end and kind of open to whatever the promptings were because they were so striking. So one of the things that was very striking about that time was that I was suddenly bombarded with my algorithm sending me the same information that I had already studied throughout my student career. And it was almost like refresher courses kind of pointing me in different directions. And one of the things that popped up was I started to look back onto Alice Bailey's writing. It popped up on my thing. And then, of course, Madame Blavatsky, and, of course, William Meader. All of those things became normalized that had basically disappeared from my algorithm for a while as I had finished studying it. And now I was getting like a refresher course. And I was really, really confused at first as to why it was so clearly being brought back to me until I started to revisit the subject matter and I realized that I myself had noticed that one of the things the conclave may be dealing with is the same thing that I have been dealing with as a student and that many of you have been studying, which is when you're a spiritual student, you are basically a medium for whatever the divine energy is that's working through you, whether you believe it's an ashram or the department you work for or the house you belong to, that you are in fact a conduit of change and that you are receiving data and acting on behalf of that. But we needed to remember, as I was going through the refresher course, that we are also doing it from our own perspective. And the truth is that we are trying to make sure that our ego does not interject its personality or personal belief system onto the downloads or onto the information that you are studying. And the reason that became so prevalent is because when I was looking at Alice Bailey's writing as a student of esotericism, one of the things that was very striking was the way that women were portrayed in that. And one of the things that I became very clear on what was happening with possibly with the conclave above was that they were then looking at it from the standpoint of how do we move forward when certain rhetoric or certain archetypes are presented that block students from the path that they're trying to pursue. And how do we then move them forward where moving them forward beyond the whole statement that William Meader makes about the temple you build today can be your prison tomorrow? How do we then evolve those incredible sacred truths into a way that's digestible for the current climate and the current situation and how the population is? Especially in a world of cancel culture when we're trying to balance the swing between the pendulums left to the right and so forth. So it became crystal clear that one of the things that I was supposed to make mention whenever I decided to do this particular post was I was supposed to speak to the responsibility that we as students and as cohorts within the Great Earth Academy have to remind ourselves of the way that we word things and the way we leave legacy content to the world. Because the more I revisited some of the subject matter that I had studied, the more I started to see things pop up that were clear red flags for most people at this era, including like the ageless wisdom, which of course if you study the ageless wisdom, you can kind of see the deviation that came from the Hitler thing, and there's certain wording that's presented in there that is part of that particular time frame that does not apply and does not work for the current population, and it became a hindrance. So I started to really pay attention to what that would mean in the content that I produce or that you guys produce, understanding that if we don't acknowledge the problems or things that have happened in our faith-based structures that have not evolved to meet the criteria of the population as it ascends, that we start to run into roadblocks that we as cohorts and students must discuss as a means to mirror the conclave and what they're trying to work on in order to move us forward. Because if you really study esotericism, there's a great deal of wording and things that are presented and preserved in a particular time frame, right? I had made a comment that one of the big things that I was looking at most recently was studying Pistis Sophia, and one of the things that really struck me was the issue that Paul had with Mary Magdalene, and how I made the connection and the point to you all as other students, teachers, and so forth, that was going to be a real issue because the way that they depicted Paul was as a misogynistic asshole. And it came from the lens of the person who was interpreting or writing the situation, adding a specific archetype structure to something sacred, which was a dialogue happening personally between people. And it preserved Paul in a light that made me have an issue with it because of the fact that I know that you cannot ascend at that level. So obviously, if Paul is indeed St. Paul, that he would have been someone who worked through that. But even in Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, you see that he is immortalized in the image with having a dagger behind his back pointing at Mary Magdalene's throat, silencing her, trying to silence her. And that is how that was preserved. So as I was going through that, I was then suddenly faced with all of these red flags that pop up within sacred texts that we as students have issues with because it blocks us from the current state of evolution that we are in, but does not speak to the writer necessarily. It depicts a time and it depicts a particular way of thinking in an era that it falls into. And you can see that across most sacred texts, but it doesn't evolve itself if we don't first acknowledge that those things are really problematic, and to then also realize that though we can see where certain dark lodges and Hitler and those things kind of misinterpreted ageless wisdom in some ways, you can see that some of the wording is triggering for anybody else who's trying to understand it. And you have to realize that as writers, though it is true that we are not responsible for the way that people receive our information, we are not, it's not necessarily liable for us to speak from a good place and have people misinterpret it and deviate from it and then try to spread a bad word about your work. We do, going forward, have a responsibility as students and cohorts to remind each other that the wording you choose will be key to the legacy that you leave. And the more as I sat with that, the more I really started to think about what was happening possibly in the conclave. And then when the actual physical conclave is meeting, which I think is today, ironically, and as they're doing that, there's so much happening behind the scenes that we as students and cohorts then have to be there for each other to kind of make sense of some of the delays and some of the shit that's going down in front of us, understanding why now I led into this video with a previous video talking about personality types and trauma bonding and what that can do on the world stage and how that then plays out karmically and so forth. But I need to do it scientifically grounded first in order to then approach you all with this particular video so that we all are on the same page. Because one of the things I noticed specifically with the esoteric theosophy and philosophy is that they really have been ahead of the curve. They did tell us from the very beginning that there was going to be the era of the forerunner, and it was called the era of the burning ground. And recently I had a dream regarding to that, where I was basically informed, like many of you might have already, that this is called the trial by fire. That what we'll be facing will be the trial by fire as a collective as we head into the first initiation. And so as I began to study that, one of the things I needed to be careful was not to interject my own general understanding without first touching base with the community to see if we're kind of on the same page. Because I don't want to be a person who runs crazy with a belief structure without having it fully grounded into myself and integrated. So one of the things that the esoteric philosophy had really talked about was that the era of the burning ground would be very hot. And it would be a very, very trials and tribulation era. And one of the things that happened was I had said to you guys in my studies from 2020 to 2025 that we were entering the dry run, which would then it would set things in motion in 2025 that would be the byproduct of what they had learned and gleaned from the trial run, and that we needed to have been fully conscious and present in that first 5 years in order to understand the lay of the land of what's to happen. And sure enough, like dominoes, just like esoteric theosophy and everybody said, all hell broke loose. 2025 started with a fire. We understood where we were at. We understood now that we're in front of the neo-Nazi regime and that's resurging and all of that type of stuff. And I wanted to kind of point out that that makes sense. And so from a spiritual perspective, one of the things that we need to remember as we go through this phase is that it's never comfortable to walk across coal, especially if it's on fire. When we talk about the era of the burning ground, we are talking about burning things away from society that no longer serve us and that need to be exposed outwardly so as to be taken care of from the highest perspective. But there comes a reckoning, a judgment phase, where we as a society have to admit why certain things are playing out. And so from an esoteric and philosophical, theosophical, and spiritual lens, what I wanted to make note to you all is that it does make sense from a philosophical and those perspectives that we would have to be dealing with the neo-Nazi aspect and that white supremacy issue because of the way that it played out after World War II and how many of the first world nations didn't penalize some of the people who were Nazis and instead incorporated them into their particular structures as spies or as intel and actually allowed their freedom, meaning that karma was never paid on behalf of those families. And so from a spiritual and philosophical lens, we can then see as a cohort group why that would then be resurfacing in order to be dealt with. Because they didn't see any justice. There was no justice to the victims in those scenarios because governments across the globe basically took them in order for their own benefit. And so that karma was never paid in lifetime. And many even still believe that that's what we're doing here. And one of the things that happened when I was thinking and processing that particular tidbit of information was I started to really think back to the different civilizations that have come before us and the fact that they kept referring to this era of the burning ground as a trial by fire. And it suddenly dawned on me that that would make sense because the last time society, humanity in its earlier roots, faced this type of atonement was during the water trial. And that's where we saw the great floods that killed off most of the population. And so it made sense to me with the solar flare upticks and the volcanoes, earthquakes, and all that stuff that this would be the trial by fire. And one of the things that became very interesting to me in that revelation as a student was then I started to really think about the civilizations that existed at that time and how many of us are said to be somehow related to different family dynamics or different personalities as souls that existed throughout time that maybe have either good karma that needs to be paid on to us or that we were the victims of some of the assailants that are also on the same board as we are. And that we need to be careful about how we judge another person, for we are ourselves being judged. And as a student, that became very clear to me in my need to take a step back for a couple weeks from the last post I had done before yesterday's in order to really process how I would approach the subject with you all. Because it does stand to make reason that if indeed we are in this clearing phase as the end of the forerunner, a forerunner indicates that it's in preparation for something big. And as I began to think about it, one of the things that they talk about in esotericism that kind of helped me kind of navigate the sea of uncertainty on this topic was it did speak to the possibility that when humanity was facing its first initiation, where it became conscious of its soul, that there would be a battle between the soul of humanity and that of the egoish nature of humanity, which would then make sense to what we're seeing between the personality types that are trying to bring us down versus the personalities that are trying to pull us up, and that constant strain that we ourselves have dealt with individually. But when looking at that particular topic, one of the things that was most striking to me in my studies was when I was reviewing it, I was reminded that for us individually as souls, when you're taking your first and second initiation, there is a particular being that is present with you that presents you to the higher ashrams and to the higher realms and to the solar logos and so forth. So if we are to understand that that is a truth for us and we really believe that, then why would you be surprised to then think that maybe the big JC would be back for this era if we are indeed as a society taking the first initiation? If he's present, if the great JC is truly the one who presents us as an initiate or as an aspirant, whatever the language is for each level, then wouldn't he be present again for when society, when humanity would be presented as well, right? Because that would mean the entirety of our species would be presented forward. So it made sense why the resurrection and the timing of the things that are happening would make sense. Because again, we are under the understanding that we were ending the forerunner phase and they would be meeting right now this year in order to discuss the things that needed to happen in order to move the board forward and to ensure that society evolved and not devolved. Which, of course, is the struggle that we're seeing with the highest nature of humanity as a soul, presenting itself outwardly into the physicality of us as individual selves within that body, and the war that then happens that we know from ourselves is what we're seeing in the world stage. It's the adulting phase. And one of the things that happens, we have to take accountability for those things. And so for the next 7 years, it's become crystal clear to me and to many of you that this is where we really hit the ground running. Because, according to esoteric theosophy and philosophy, one of the things that we've come to understand is that the elders and masters that pull themselves out of society would be externalizing themselves again. But in order for that to happen, society would have to make their first initiation. And I started to then count how many initiations there were. And one of the things that was striking to me was that if the big JC comes back, then he's proving and grounding as a potentiality the fifth initiation, because that's the resurrection. And one of the things that we notice from our biblical lore and all of the things that we've studied is that he did indeed resurrect and come back, and why we celebrate Easter the way that we do. But it was a short-lived experience. It was almost like a hint of what was to come. But if all the elders and masters are indeed supposed to externalize if we pass this test, then it would make sense that the being, the great JC, would have to be present as the anchor point to allow that to happen. And that anything that was threatening to him or to any of the elders or masters needed to be dealt with immediately before any of that could happen. And a lot of what we're seeing is a lot of dominoes begin to fall quite quickly, where a lot of different groupings and different legacies from different cultures and different beings are indeed having to pay their penalties, their penance and their penalties for the karmic retribution that is owed onto others. And as student bodies, the one thing that we've been told is do not judge another, for you will be judged. And so I really started to look at it from that lens, and I started to make sense of things that we were seeing from that perspective. Understanding that I'm sorry, I'm sweating, I don't have the air on in order to be quiet. But one of the things that became crystal clear to me is that in order for them to externalize, it would have to be a safe environment. And this is not it. And suddenly when I was thinking about the conclave and all the things that were happening right now, it became crystal clear that we have about 7 years in order to do the, to get everything finally prepared. And that many of the teachers dressed as students were scouts, preparing the way for all of this to play out. And we can see that in kind of the ascension of humanity and how widespread the awakening has occurred and the overextension of woke culture and all of the things that are happening, playing out in live time, that it does match up with the conclave that was already meeting above us. And that the prompting I was receiving was to speak to other cohorts and students at that level and remind them that it is important how we speak and how we present ourselves right now, because many of us may be graduating with a degree of a doctorate or whatever you want to believe, but you're moving up, you're ascending. And as you ascend, you take on different graces and different responsibilities. And one of the things that I found myself in was the phase where I obviously had done something right. But seeing as I'm not someone who chases title, prestige, mastery, or anything like that, none of that motivates me. My desire is to serve and to be as good of a student as I can be and continuously evolve. But I'm not driven by the egoish nature to be seen, heard, or acknowledged. Instead, my focus is in how can I be of service in order to help other people maybe make sense of what they're experiencing from my own personal life experience. And in that, one of the things that became very clear to me was that that was actually a benefit to us as a cohort group, was the sheer amount of people who are willing to take a back seat and not be on stage right now in order to finish up the training and tutorials that they need to do, because they may indeed then be, in a huge possibility, the teachers of the generation of elders and masters that reemerge. And that's an incredible responsibility. So I wanted us to become really, really clear as a cohort group that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. But one of the things that happens when you graduate at whatever level you do is there's a grace period. And in that grace period, it feels like a void. And one of the greatest trials that someone can take when they're taking their initiations is when they do graduate. And they then have to choose of their own accord what they're going to do with their accrued wisdom, not just knowledge, but the wisdom and life experience that they have. What path will they take with their degree? And that can be one of the most trying and annoying parts. Because up until then, if we study esotericism and all of the other higher realm theosophies and philosophies, we've always been guided by something outside of ourselves. And when we reach that particular pivot at that point in our life, we begin to acknowledge the fact that they may be asking us to make the final decision. And since we've been following a star for so long, that can be very jarring to a group of people who don't even know what role they've been cast to play in and what is currently being written in the conclave. And this is super important because I made a faux pas the other day. I was working through my own shadow because, as many of you know, I really embrace my shadow. My shadow, even if it's in wrong alignment, always indicates something that's flaring up. And so I've learned to take stock of it and literally look at it and go, okay, Where is this coming from? And I don't suppress it. I don't shy away from it. I know that it's there now serving me. And I need to then take the opportunity to observe it from an observer standpoint and also as the integrated soul that is then dealing with it, because it's there for a reason and it's always served me well, even when I was in wrong alignment fighting it. So one of the things that happened is during this last, week since the whole thing went down, and so much was changing in my own life, in my own sphere of consciousness, and there's just like a lot of radio silence. I began to do what I normally do, which is speak through my shadow, basically meaning working with my shadow audibly. And one of the things that I realized suddenly, not really paying attention, was I was pulling attention possibly from the conclave or from my guides and other beings that were actively working on more important things than just me. And understanding that even though I am Al, that I am but an avatar to something much greater than I, that is actively part of something that is working on the evolution of a species, and that I needed to acknowledge the fact that I apologize profusely if I did pull any attention away from them, because I realized that the radio silence is a good thing. If no one's telling me that I need to do something, then why not sit in that peace and take it as a blessing? But instead, I was trying to make shit happen because I felt like I wasn't using all of the tutelage and skill sets. And that's when the epiphany came to me about the fact that I am now being tasked with waiting for them to finish deciding what's going to happen. And that many of us as students and cohorts are facing the same dilemma, which is the same thing that you would see in a production of a movie or a TV show or anything like that. When the writers are preparing to shoot, even up to the minute the cameras go on, you are given new lines. They're changing your marks. And if someone didn't make the cut that they were supposed to graduate with you for X, Y, and Z, now they have to recast that part. And then let's say I fucked up and stepped out of alignment, and now they need to recast my part. All of this is happening actively while everything else starts to kind of crash down and burn around us, right? Because again, through esotericism, we know this is harmony through chaos. And no one can argue that we're not seeing the beginning of the chaos. And basically understanding it from our perspective helps us better understand what we're dealing with. But we do also have to allow ourselves the grace and the patience to acknowledge that it can be quite trying to someone who's always been following a guide or a teacher or something, that suddenly is being pulled away to save space and to sit there in grace and be like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to pull your attention. I know you're busy. It's not just about us anymore, it's about us. I mean, it's not just about you and me individually, it's about all of us. And so as we face this transition, this year in particular is quite revealing. And one of the things that we have a benefit of as students of esotericism, of philosophy or theosophy, is that we can kind of gauge where things are going by where we've been, but understanding that it's subject to change at any moment, and we must be able to pivot. And the reason I'm bringing this up is what keyed that whole conversation I started to have with myself as I worked through my shadow was that I could sense a massive pivot coming my direction. And it's something that all of you have faced with intuition and being students of the academy. You know when something's about to happen. And I'm not one of those people that worries about bad things happening because I don't put that into the universe. But I can see that there is a career pivot or an opportunity that is coming my direction. And because I'm actively writing my own script in compliance with what they are saying, I'm actively having to participate in a greater role than I did before. And that can be quite jarring to some of us who have always been following the bouncing ball as we sing the karaoke song. You know what I mean? Like we're doing our best and we're studying and all that stuff. But at some point, when a graduate when they do their dissertation or when they get their master's degree, they have to choose the field that they're going to work in. And they have to then take all of that amalgamation of information, wisdom, knowledge, and experience and apply it in a 3D setting. And they have to do it on behalf at our level, not of themselves, but of the ashram department or the higher realms. And that is a trust fall. And so as we collectively embrace these changes and walk ourselves forward, we're going to have to touch base with each other and kind of see if you're getting the same type of thing as that we're all, the others are getting. To see if we have a cohesion of the intel that we're getting so as to really allow the conclave to continue to do what they're doing without pulling their attention towards us right now because there is so much at stake, right? We know that if the elders and masters are going to come back, that they cannot come back to the current climate or situation. That's why they retracted in the first place. But if we are truly to believe what we believe, then we know that for them to return, the things had to change, and they had to be abrupt. And if we are indeed in the era of the burning ground, then they're burning away all that no longer serves us as we make way for the resurrection phase of humanity, which would be the only way that the Big JC and the elders and masters would reemerge. So they're essentially grounding the fifth initiation into humanity's consciousness by actively returning. And it lent itself quite nicely to my understanding of being careful of the teachers dressed as students because they are always observing you. But many of us did not bother to wonder how many scouts there were on the ground who stood before you and were trying to tell you information. Because one of the things that happens in any type of clique or any type of dogmatic or spiritual principle is that we pack mentality in the same way that lower vibrations do it, so do higher vibrations. They pack into their department. But the challenge that we're facing is the release of the 5 new rays up to ray 12, which is the golden ray, and the integration of such knowledge into ourselves before we can disseminate it externally to the rest of the world, and how that might look. Because it's no coincidence then, by what our logic is so far, that for those things to have just been released, that they're going to play a major part in what happens in 7 years from now. But this transition is rough. It's not easy. A lot of us are going to have to prove are going to have to be the powerhouse people that we've been trained to be in a quiet way now outwardly as things begin to fall down, right? Because if you're going to restabilize or restructure something, that means that other things have to collapse in on itself. And watching that happen, as I've said before, is quite trying. It's a lot easier for us to go through the trials and tribulations and the drama, the horrible things that have happened to us. It's easier for us to get through it than it is to watch our children or to watch our friends or to watch society go through it collectively. It's much more trying and a little bit harder. So you have to have the mastery being centered and being able to pull yourself into a centered state while everyone else begins to crumble. Because they have to. In order for society to make the first initiation, sometimes they first have to understand that the soul is not just an ideal, it's something that actually exists within them. And sometimes the only way for a soul to get a lost student is to shake the shit out of their lives. And those towers create a lot of ripples. But we are we are given the opportunity to be the beacons. Remember, esoterically speaking, as students and cohorts, as teachers and so forth, we have come to understand that the light burns within the heart and it burns within the crown. Great. But during this next phase, what I'm understanding is reminiscent of what we saw in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, when the young one goes and he sets the first pyre of fire on top of the mountain. Remember, you stand on the mountain. That is your task. If you're at this level, then you have stood on the mountain and you have stood firmly founded on the rock. And as your crown goes up, it may just serve the same way that it did in that movie, where then the next mountain many, many, many miles away from you catches you online or somehow, and their crown goes up. And suddenly you have what used to be a flame or a candle now standing, towering as a beacon. And those beacons then mark the beginning of the era. And so that's an important concept to explore for each other, and I should say with one another. But by the time it was all said and done, one of the things that I really, really came to understand is that this is going to take a great deal of patience from all of us, because what we're understanding spiritually is going to be grounded into the earthly plane. And seeing as of all of the different studies that I've had, esotericism has the better success rate in forecasting how it will play, it's important to remember that science is also destined to meet us in the middle. And the reason I say that is because it's not just esotericism that has foretold of this particular new race of humans that come from this next era of trials and tribulations. It is spoken to in something as simple as spiral dynamics, where they were talking about the arrival of the turquoise leadership and how they would guide humanity forward as an evolutionary model. So now both science and faith are mirroring each other. And the closer we get towards the, I think, 2032, 33, I think by the time 2033, then everything will be presented and we will know exactly where we stand. But there's going to be a larger section of the population who will have to walk the coals. And a lot of us are going to have to put aside our swords and be there for each other and stand as the beacon of hope when other people's lives begin to crumble. And how do we know that? Because the only way we reach this destination is by our lives being destroyed. Those tower moments had to happen in order to get us into alignment. But again, it's a lot easier for us, being as strong as we are and being the people that we've become, to have gone through it and then look back on and be like, I don't know what the big deal is. Meanwhile, everybody's like, I don't know how you survived that. But because of who we are, it's not about just us. It's about us as a collective. And as consciousness evolves and is faced with its shadow and those wars happen, we need to remind people that you can make it through, as we did, on an individual level. Because if you want to really understand the world stage and where we're at, you first look into yourself. And is why it was so heavily, why that was so relevant in the last piece I did from a psychological standpoint about people who have trauma that haven't healed that trauma. Hurt people hurt other people. And personalities that are acting out right now are acting out because they're afraid of change. We can identify with that. When our lives changed, we didn't have an opportunity to do it electively. It just happened. And so, maybe there's a handful of you who elected to do it. But at some point, you ask yourself why I was doing it. Because you stop being focused on your ego, and your ego wanting to be seen, or you stop focused on the idea of mastery. A master does not worry that they're a master. In fact, one of the greatest conversations I ever had internally was I was getting frustrated with people continuously talking about perfected ones. And I'm like, but that's subjective, right? To the Dark Lodge, Hitler was a perfected being. It was the perfect form of evil that ever walked the earth. And so for them, he would be an example of perfected being. Whereas to, let's say, Archangel Michael, or to God himself, herself, itself, whatever you believe that to be, you, in being the perfected thought form, acting in right relations as you're intended to be, would be perfected to them. And so it was very important for me at the time to break away from trying to relate to other people's understanding of things in order to stand atop the mountain and hold space for change. Because one of the things about any type of spiritual exploration is that, like William Meter said, the temple you build today can be your prison tomorrow. And you have to be able to receive the changes and data from whatever department, ashram, higher realm, whatever you believe, however you phrase it. You need to be open to receive the information that you will need in order to thrive when so many other people are going to be going through turmoil and hell, right? Because if it is true that many of us have a lot of unpaid karma, then the next 7 years, in quick succession, should help those beings burn through it, if they can make it. And that is a serious conversation to have when many of our people are already going through therapy. And so we then have to be there spiritually, not just psychologically, to be there for people and help them make sense of a changing dynamic in a world. Because I'll put it to you this way. There's no way I would ever, like if the conclave was asking me that if it was time for them to come, I'd be like, nope, not until a lot of loose ends are tied up. Because there's too much going on, There's still children being raped. There's still parents raping children. There's like all of this shit, the child trafficking, perverted islands. None of those people have seen justice. So why would and now they want to, what is it? I used it as an example in the last post. And now somebody in Florida wanted to and replace the migrant workers that were being deported with children working those positions. And I was like, well, that's convenient. Because if you make them at a young age start working, then they become considered adults. And that's really yummy for pedos. Because now they have free aim and free range because they're considered adulted. It changes the statutory rape laws immediately. And so there's so much happening beyond what we see that the conclave is trying to work through, that we as students need to begin working with each other independently while being receptive to what they're prompting us to do. Because speaking from first-hand experience, having done the dry run from 2020 to 2025, there's a massive migration about to happen. And a lot of people who had stability will have everything ripped from them with AI. And then a lot of people who once were at a certain position in middle class will suddenly find themselves in a lower class. And then we're going to have to worry about the humanity crisis that will happen with the poor and the homeless. And their knee-jerk reaction to get rid of them. Well, what does that look like and what does that mean? These are all things we are consciously aware of, whereas the ashram and the higher realm and the conclaves are dealing with it from a much higher perspective in order to ensure that the people that have been chosen are not affected the same way as others are affected because they already did the work. And then we have to embody the experience and the amalgamation of information and things we've studied in a way that communicates to people like us from our department that helps them make sense of a changing world and a climate that is this catastrophic, right? Because you remember, in the higher perspectives, if you read Pistis Sophia and other of the more sacred texts that are kind of more in the background, you understand that the word apocalypse is not the end of the world. It's the end of the way of life. It really speaks to an old, outdated paradigm being reset. And what would that look like? And with people who hate change as much as humanity hates change, being comfortable even in the worst states, why some people stay in abusive relationships? Because it's the drama that they know. And there's a familiarity and almost a comfort there. So when you've been bombarded and pushed down for so long, it's really hard to then try to free them. And then to those of you who find yourself as liberated souls who pay off the karma, you are then faced with, what do you do now? What service will you bring humanity? How do you find your right alignment with other people? And a lot of that's going to have to do with open dialogue. But make no mistake, this is a trial by fire. And this entire era is going to heavily rely on what the big JC and the others decide to do in preparation for the externalization of the elders and masters that are set to come. Because they're the ones who will, in theory, and from a philosophical standpoint, from an owl theory, it would make sense that they would need to be present if they're going to usher in the Aquarian age. You would need more than just teachers, rest of students, because you would then have to build the academies and the schools that mirror the higher realms academies and schools in order to ensure that those children, those elders and masters, are able to succeed in their mission that happens after we finish going through this era of the burning ground. It makes sense. What, we really thought that the big JC would return without having an incredible amount of security and crew around him? Come on, man. We know that's bullshit. And so we know that there are going to be a lot of scouts. And I've been saying to everybody, be careful, because of the way that we speak about each other and the way that we poo-poo, poo-poo? The way that we poo-poo other people's belief systems, when we know for a fact that the mana that we seek is every gem of truth is hidden in different houses. So who are we to begrudge them or stop someone else from entering the New Age movement as a means to get home when we know that all roads lead home? And we need to be starting to band together and understanding that even in Esoteric Theosophy, this is still a philosophy, and it's going to be what helps propel humanity forward. It'll help make sense of what we're going through and help people find solace that there is hope and the fact that you and I even exist. Because I'm going to tell you something, the way that it came through to me in some of the dreams I had, specifically the one with the air of the burning ground, and I was in the backyard of my house with a hose talking to one of the girls that I lived with, and I was literally I was hosing it down because the fire was coming, but it wasn't reaching my house. My house was safe. But I was still standing there and go, well, let me go take a walk. And I left in the dream to take a walk around the perimeter of the estate. I call it an estate, but it was a group of homes. And we were not in jeopardy. But I did stumble across a carnival, and the carnival was closed. And they made mention of something about insurance. I don't know, it was like a whole thing. But I suddenly saw a bunch of volcanoes, and I saw the solar flares, and I just saw a lot of melee that has to do with burning. And as we know, that a lot of different religions and people believe that fire is a great purification point. And so understand that when people face fire, they can come in many different forms. I mean, look at cancel culture. It's like facing an intellectual firestorm. Or, a fire, what is it called when the people shoot people? It's called, I forgot what it's called. But facing, the guns and stuff. Like, all of this is playing out in a very vivid way. But we understand that it's heading somewhere. And if we can relate to how we got to where we are, then other people will know that there's hope. And hope is the only thing that will trump all of this. It will be the only thing that helps humanity as a whole make it through this particular junction. Because they're in desperate search of the heroes that are being born now that people don't see. Again, William Meter, who's one, by the way, if you're a first or second initiate or someone seriously on the path, I don't know the man, but I honestly can highly recommend him. He's probably my favorite teacher that's in living form that I've ever studied with, because the way that he grounds information is easily digestible, And he specifically works with first and second degree initiates, from what I've observed. I don't know that for a fact, but from the way that he speaks. And he's instrumental to those of you who are teachers or as students who are having to go through a quick succession boot camp to remind you of what you're doing here. Because you're going to have to ground the energy as cohorts, as you're grouping. If you're part of an ashram or a department and you are actively working on their behalf, not just yours anymore, then you are going to find each other very quickly and you will build something together that will finish preparing the way for the elders and masters to return. And if they do, then that of course makes sense in the Aquarian age, because it's all about, ceremony and mystical magic and so forth. These are all grounded efforts of skill sets that it would make sense that elders and masters would be the bestowers of upon humanity. But not all of humanity will receive those blessings, and nor will they make the cut. And a lot of it will have to do about how we parlay the information that we are speaking to in a way that helps people understand it at a grounded level, that helps a new student make sense of what they're encountering, right? Because there's there's so many different misconceptions right now. One of the things that I love studying is anytime somebody says that they've been through a dark night of the soul, and it's been like only 2-3 years, I'm like, your ego went through the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is when you have an entire lifetime or lifetimes of that until you find your way and you finally remember what's going on. But it can be lifetimes or a lifetime of a dark night of the soul. It doesn't flash before your eyes. And if it does, then it's usually ego-driven. Your ego is dying. It's going through its dark night of the soul. Because if in right alignment, one of the things that I found very interesting is that you find yourself looking at your content and you no longer see yourself. You see your ashram. You see your teachers. And you acknowledge them. It's very surreal. I had it happen recently. And I thought it was my ego and I had to check myself. But I was looking at something foreign to me. I was looking at it from the perspective of who I was in the past and how surprised I was to be hearing the words out of the elders out of my mouth. And I could see the big JC, I could see the Buddha, I could see Mary Magdalene, I could see, John, I could see these things. I could see Alan Watts in my presentation. It was very interesting because you are their people. And as we move towards the collective consciousness and the evolution of that outwardly, as we blossom into the lotus petal, the next layer of it, then we have to understand that we will be working with each other in different ways. And that's why in the last piece, I was so specific about changing your approach and how you reach people who work for the Dark Lodge or who are just lost. You cannot, if someone is already aggressive and out for just attention, then the only way to really deal with it is to starve them of that attention. But to at least open and extend the olive branch to be divine and say to them, hey, I see your trauma, and then let it go. Not your monkeys, not your shell. You cannot save another human. You cannot. And so many people are sitting there saying, oh, I'm going to save you. How can you save someone? They have to do the work. And how do you exhibit that? Well, you present yourself in your authenticity. And the people who are at your level will see you. And you all will come together and you will build. But make no mistake, this next 7-year cycle is rough. We have AI coming through. We have mass deportations. We have a huge migration now underway. People are going to be leaving. People are going to be coming. It's a whole thing. We have to deal with the karma of the neo-Nazi thing, which is resurfacing, obviously. Then we have the whole thing with the Atlanteans and the whole Dark Lodge stuff that's resurfacing. All of these things being almost acting as a double indemnity to souls that did not learn. And the weird part is it's willful ignorance. They see the signs, and some of them will still ignore it. But it's not your task. Everything in life exists in opposition of each other. It's a balance. God, or whatever you believe the great architect to be, created light and dark. They complement each other. In fact, I would say that you would probably see them married to each other. That is a divine union. And that's one of the reasons that when you see like the Cancer symbol in astrology, you see it as the yin-yang, as a circle, and it spins. But it's married to each other. It's part of a whole. And so understand that those things will exist. But you have to navigate the realities of what you're encountering on an intellectual and intuitive level. And a lot of people don't know what that means. And so as they begin to have their awakening, they're also being forced or being faced with the Dark Lodge and those corrupted beings who are calling them names in order to suppress them and make them feel ridiculous. In reality, they are aspiring to be better than where we were. And in that action, they have the momentum. But we need to be the examples of the walking amalgamations that we are as students of different theosophies and philosophies. So my closing remark on this particular post, I'm not going to write on this one like I did yesterday with the other one. Instead, what I'm going to say is let's start respecting each other's philosophy, theosophy, and perspective, because we are all of the divine. And in that, we are talking about full integration. And that integration of the soul's presence does create change in the way that other people interact with you. But it has to start with us in mutual respect of each other. And stop saying shit like, what did it say? Oh, you know what's so funny? What's so funny about the people in New Age movement is they just pick and choose what works for them. Meanwhile, the way that you got to where you are is by finding the Easter eggs in each house, which is the same process. So we need to start looking at each other through respectful eyes, understanding that most of us are now engaged with the divine. And when you meet your tribe, you are active agent on behalf of the divine, having a conversation with another divine being. And many divine unions will come with that. All of this is in preparation for something big. So let's use our minds, our teamwork mentality, and build something that supports what we know is coming. Because if they do externalize, then a lot of what we're going through suddenly gets healed. And one of the greatest things that we can do for each other is to heal each other by hearing each other's voice and acknowledging that though we may have different opinions or different approaches, that in the end, all roads can lead home. So why not be there for each other as cohorts, as students, and as esotericists or philosophers, and understand that your journey is part of a collective group. And that collective group is integrating Christ consciousness, and then beyond that, God consciousness. And as they work through that, we are brothers and sisters, regardless of where you come from. Because it's the only way we're going to make it through the next 7-8 years. And that's all I wanted to say. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I hope this was cohesive and made sense, but I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye.